Hello, dear students. Very warm welcome to the class. Everyone, we have been reading the topic, chapter number 9, globalization. And in this globalization chapter, we have been just discussing each and every dimension of the globalization. And as you all know that each coin has two aspects. Globalization also has positives and few negatives also. So we have been discussing that. And so far we have discussed a lot of about globalization. Now we will continue with the topic economic consequences, the economic outcomes, the economic results of the globalization. So while everything may not be known about the economic facts of the globalization, this particular dimension, the dimension regarding the economic consequences, the economic results. Large part of the content and direction of contemporary debate surrounds the globalization. Apart from the problem has to do with defining economic globalization itself. The mention of our economic globalization draws our attention immediately to the role of international institutions. As you know that currently there are various financial international institutions like IMF, WTO, which works for the global trade and even sets certain rules which have to be followed by the members of the WTO. So IMF, WTO, and the role they play in determining economic policies across the world. So it's very important. With the globalization, this is also happening that the policies of the countries are also getting affected by the globalization. That's what we discussed in our last class also, that how the world is changing from that state oriented policy to the market oriented policy with the growth of the globalization. So yet globalization must not be viewed in such narrow terms. However, economic globalization involves many actors other than these international institutions. As a much broader way of understanding of economic globalization requires us to look at the distribution of economic gains. Now, it is very important to understand that with the process of the globalization, who gets the better? Because who gets the most from the globalization and who gets the less? Indeed, who loses from it? This is the important question which we need to ask. Now, many critics of the globalization say that it is only the developed countries, the Western countries or the developed countries, they are getting much benefit of the globalization rather than the developing or the poor countries. They are even suffering from it. The critics who analyze, who criticize the process of globalization, they say this point of view. What is often called economic globalization usually involves, and now what do you mean by the economic globalization? So the movement usually involves the flow, greater economic flows among different countries of the world. So the movement of the commodities, the movement of the people, the movement of the idea, the movement of the capital, combinedly we call it as globalization. So some of this movement is voluntary and some forced by international institutions. So as we discussed that being member of WTO, World Trade Organization, whatever the WTO says, the members has to follow all the instructions and all the rules or all the norms set by the WTO. So therefore, it is said that the norms are made to give certain kind of benefits, and the critics who analyze these institutions, they say that these international institutions make certain rules and regulations which are beneficial for the Western countries, which are beneficial for the developed countries, mainly, not Western specifically, developed countries. So here we need to understand that there are many critics who criticize the involvement of these big institutions, and it forces the countries to follow the rules, follow the norms, and it gives benefit to the powerful countries. We saw in the examples at the beginning of this chapter, this flow or exchange can take various forms. As we all know, in the form of commodity, in the form of capital, in the form of people, in the form of ideas. Combinedly, we call it a globalization. The movement of these things, these four things. Globalization has involved greater trade in commodities across the globe. The restrictions imposed by different countries on allowing the imports of other countries have been reduced. So with the globalization, these all things are happening. The trade barriers are being removed, and the steps are being taken to enhance the globalization process. So movement of capital across countries have also been restrictions. So the restrictions on the movement of capital flow, the foreign investment, or these restrictions also have been removed. And these are kind of symbol that how globalization is taking pace, how it is just moving very fast. The countries are adopting certain measures, certain steps, which are helping the process of the globalization. So in operational terms, it means that investors in the rich countries, now they can invest money in the countries other than their own, including developing countries, where they might get even better returns because they find the cost of the production very less in these countries. So they may set their manufacturing unit here in the developing or in the poor countries, and that's how they can get the benefit. So globalization has also led the flow of ideas across national boundaries. The spread of internet, computer related services is an example of that. So with the growth of the communication, what happened? Just remember once again the example, the first example, Janardhan became John. So because of the computer, because of the technology, because of the internet, now John or means Janardhan is able to work in work of a company which is situated in America and resolving the problems of the customers who are there in America. So with the improvement, with the enhancement of the communication and technology, this has become possible. So developed countries have carefully, however, these all lines are very important lines. These days, many laws have been made in these developing or developed countries mainly. These countries have carefully guarded their borders with visa policies to ensure that citizens of other countries cannot take away the jobs of their own citizens. Now, it's not only in America, but also in many European countries because of mass movement of the people from the developing countries to the developed countries. Now the native people of these countries are demanding that laws must be made to protect the jobs there in their own country. So many these developed countries have carefully guarded their own borders with certain policies and programs to ensure that their citizen also get the proper work. So they in the chapter international organization, in the chapter US hegemony, you also might have read that how Americans try to mold the rules of not only even United Nations but also many other international institutions according to their own interest. So that's what we need to understand, that these developed countries play that kind of role. So in thinking about the consequences of globalization, it is necessary to keep in mind that same set of policies don't lead to the same results everywhere. While globalization has led to similar economic policies adopted by governments in different parts of the world, this has generated vastly different outcomes in different parts of the world. So with the change in the region, with the change in the system, the governments are adopting different policies. However, the main intent currently, in the current circumstances, in the current time period, the main intent of all the government is just to remove the trade barriers, to give the pace to the globalization process. So it is again crucial to pay attention to specific context rather than make simple generalization in this connection. Economic globalization has created an intense division of opinion all over the world. Those who are concerned about social justice are worried about the extent of state withdrawal caused by process of economic globalization. So both the people who criticize the process of the globalization, there are supporters, there are people who are not in support of the globalization. So what they say, they usually say that with the globalization, the social justice, this has become a major problem, that now because everything is left on the shoulder of the market, so market is creating a gap between the rich and the poor, and that is a very need of concern, है ना? So therefore, with the process of economic globalization, the social justice, that worries, because now state uh, trying to liberalize everything, so it is just left everything on the shoulder of the market, है ना? Competition, for open competition, that is the part of the globalization. So they point out that it is likely to benefit only a smaller section of the population, while impoverishing those who were dependent on the government for jobs and welfare. Even those who were for their basic necessities, they were dependent. So now with the process of the globalization, what has happened? The people who criticize it, they say that the this globalization is benefiting only small section of the population, and they are even getting like uh, they are ultra rich, na? Or their wealth is just getting bigger and bigger, whereas the poor are suffering, they are even impoverishing. So the gap between the rich and the poor section in the society is also widening, and that is need of concern. Now, they have emphasized the need to ensure institutional safeguards. Now, the people who criticize the globalization, they usually say that there must be institutional safeguard. It simply means that the state must protect the rights or must provide basic necessities, must take everything in its own hand. Otherwise, the capitalist or the rich section of the society will just take most of the share in the resources. So it is the responsibility of the institutions made by the government to safeguard or create a social safety nets to minimize the negative effects. This term is also very important, social safety nets. So here what it means that the people who criticize the globalization process, they said that it is the responsibility of the government to create a social safety net, that with the globalization people don't fall, like behind. They also like must get the benefits of the globalization. So that's how, to minimize the negative effects, there must be social safety nets of globalization on those who are economically weak. So it is the responsibility of the institutions to protect them. Many movements all over the world feel that safety nets are insufficient or unworkable. They have called for a halt to forced economic globalization. So many throughout the world, many institutions, many political groups or international groups, non-governmental organizations, they have been clearly saying that the forced economic globalization must be stopped. And because its result would lead to economic ruin for the weaker countries, because the benefits, much benefits will be taken by the only bigger countries. So especially for the poor within these countries, they will suffer the most. They are the vulnerables. So therefore, the forced economic globalization must be stopped. Some economists have described economic globalization as recolonization of the world. Even few economists even went further, and they are saying that it is a kind of recolonization of the world, through the power, the developed countries. Like you see, the companies of these developed countries everywhere throughout the globe. What about the rest of the countries, about their own companies and their own traders and businesses? Now, throughout the globe, with the globalization, much of the share like uh, are being taken by these big developed countries companies. So it is, the critics say that it is a kind of recolonization where only the developed countries or only few countries or only few section of society are getting much of the benefit. So advocates of economic globalization, however, what they say, they argue that it generates greater economic growth and well-being for larger section of the population. Now we have just discussed about the negative fallouts and the critics who criticize the globalization. Now there are people who also support it. What they say that the economic growth with the globalization happens in a very large scale and very fast manner, and well-being for larger section of the population when there is deregulation. So greater trade among countries allows each economy to do what it does best. So this would benefit the whole world, not to a specific country. Now, they also argue that economic globalization is inevitable. You cannot stop it. It will happen. And it is not wise to resist the march of the history. So, the many economists or many supporters of the globalization, they clearly say that it is inevitable. We cannot stop the globalization process. So, we should not resist it by just putting trade barriers or making hindrance against the process of the globalization. So more moderate supporters of globalization say that globalization provides a challenge that can be responded to intelligently without accepting it uncritically. So the moderate supporters, what they say that globalization provides a challenge. There are challenges and that can be responded uh, with the demand of the time. As new challenges come with the globalization, so according to that, some policies can be molded, can be made, but we cannot like stop it, or we cannot forcefully do the things, you know? So these are the views of the moderates. What however cannot be denied is the increased momentum towards interdependence and integration between governments, businesses and ordinary people in different parts of the world as a result of globalization. So as a result of globalization, what happened? The integration has happened in a very fast manner. the integration between the governments, businesses, ordinary people, and different part of the world, in different section of the world. So therefore, with the globalization, this has happened. The integration has happened, or the momentum has taken its place. This is all about the economic outcomes of the globalization. Now we're going to discuss about the cultural consequences. Now, dear students, we have come to our next topic, and that is cultural consequences. Very interesting topic this is. So the consequences of globalization are not confined only to a sphere of politics and economy. Globalization also affects us in our home, in what we eat, what we drink, what we wear, and indeed what we think. This is very interesting, sir. Absolutely. Just take a simple example of just take and go through this cartoon. Here in this cartoon, also, you can understand how, invading new markets. So earlier, as you know, invasion used to be happen by the force, by the military. But here, few cartoons have been shown to you and have been just giving you that message that how the Western culture or the Westernization of the world is happening. And this is also a kind of invasion. However, it has been just pointed out as invading new markets, and it is allowed even. So the companies, just take simple example of information technology in IT sector. You find in computer like processors, the company, many big companies, they are related to Americans. You find, uh, we also discussed in our previous classes that in Hollywood movies, even to save the world, who comes first? The Superman or the superheroes, they all are Americans or maybe the Westerners. Even if the world needs to fight with the alien, who comes first? In the Hollywood movies, it is always the Westerners or mainly the Americans. So through these soft power, they have just invaded the other cultures also. Now, throughout the world, the culture, people used to wear, they had their own cultural attire, but now the jeans or the clothes which used to be like, they were firstly they were mainly used in Western countries, then they just moved from there to throughout the globe. So this is known as the cultural consequence of the globalization. Now, very interesting example. A few other examples also have been given to you in the paragraph. Let's go through them also. So, the cultural consequences of the globalization also affects us. What we eat, what we drink, what we wear, indeed what we think. That also gets affected by the globalization. So, it shapes what we think are our preference. The cultural effect of globalization leads to the fear that this process poses a threat to cultures in the world. It does so because globalization leads to the rise of uniform culture, or what is called cultural homogenization. So the uniform culture, like the Western culture, is just going across the globe. So the rise of uniform culture, sir, is it bad to have a uniform culture? It is not bad to have uniform culture, but what about the local cultures? Because these have been the heritages. So it is not the emergence of a global culture. The rise of uniform culture is not the emergence of a global culture. What we have in the name of a global culture is the imposition of Western culture on the rest of the world. This is need of concern. This is very important to understand. We have already studied this phenomena in our US hegemony chapter, the popularity of burger or blue jeans. Some argue has a lot to do with the powerful influence of the American way of life. So how the things associated with America have prevailed the world. So thus the culture of the politically and economically dominated society leaves its imprint on a less powerful society. So the dominated society just leaves its imprint on the less powerful society. And those who make this argument often draw McDonaldization of the world, with cultures seeking to buy into the dominant American dream. This is dangerous not only for the poor countries, but for the whole of the humanity, for it leads to the shrinking of the rich culture heritage of the entire globe. So therefore, it is need of concern. At the same time, it would be a mistake, however, to assume that cultural consequences of globalization are only negative. cultures are not static things. All cultures accept outside influences all the time. Some external influences are negative because they reduce our choices, but sometimes external influences simply enlarge our choices. And sometimes they modify our culture without overwhelming the traditional. जैसे एक एग्जांपल आपको दे रखा है, बर्गर कोई सब्स्टिट्यूट नहीं हो सकता मसाला डोसा का, है ना. बर्गर इज नो सब्स्टिट्यूट फॉर अ मसाला डोसा, एंड देयरफॉर it is not a, it cannot pose a, like a big threat. It is simply added, हमारे पास फूड चॉइसेस और दूसरी अवेलेबल होगी. ब्लू जीन्स ऑन द अदर हैंड कैन गो वेल विद ए होमस्पन खादी कुर्ता. तो कुर्ते के साथ में कोई जीन्स पहनता है, और ऐसा कल्चर हमारे यहाँ पे नहीं, वेस्टर्न कंट्रीज में लोग फॉलो करने लगे थे, एक तरीके से फ्यूजन बन गया ना. सो आउटकम्स ऑफ outside influence is a new combination, like a khadi kurta worn over jeans, interestingly. So this clothing combination has been exported back to the country jahan se wo blue jeans ka origin hua tha. Now you can find many Americans wearing kurta and jeans. So while cultural homogenization is an aspect of globalization, the same process also generates precisely the opposite effect. It leads to each culture becoming more efficient and distinctive. This phenomenon is cultural heterogenization. This is not to deny there remain differences in power when culture interact, but instead more fundamentally to suggest that culturally exchange is rarely one way. So therefore, that's how homogenization uh, of the culture and heterogenization of the culture can happen. Now, all of you, we just have